The morning sun filtered through the windows of Gate 24B at JFK International Airport as passengers slowly began to board Flight 381 to San Francisco. Among the first to step onto the jet bridge was Michael Carter, a tall, well-dressed black man in his early 40s. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and moved with the calm confidence of someone used to boardrooms and business-class lounges. Michael was no ordinary traveler. He was the founder and CEO of Right Tech Solutions, a multi-billion-dollar tech firm specializing in ethical AI and customer service innovation. But on this day, none of that seemed to matter. Michael had booked seat 2A in first class, a window seat known for its generous legroom, essential for working comfortably during long cross-country flights. As a Platinum Elite member of Airlines, he had every right to be there. He arrived early, greeted the gate agents warmly, and boarded when his group was called. Once seated, Michael placed his briefcase beneath the seat in front of him and pulled out his tablet, already prepping for his keynote presentation at the Global Ethics and Technology Conference. The cabin crew began closing the overhead bins when a sharply dressed white woman in her mid-50s appeared beside him, tapping her designer watch impatiently. "I always sit here," she said under her breath, but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Her name was Charlotte Bennett, a regular on this route and known by some crew members for her generous tipping habits. Moments later, Amanda Lewis, the senior flight attendant, approached with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Excuse me, sir," she began politely, but with a trace of condescension in her tone. "There seems to be a seating issue. This seat is usually reserved for our Platinum regular, Ms. Bennett." Michael looked up, momentarily confused. "This is my assigned seat," he said calmly, retrieving his boarding pass and Platinum card from his wallet. "I booked it weeks ago." Amanda glanced at the documents, her smile tightening. "Yes, I see that. But Ms. Bennett is one of our most frequent flyers and usually prefers this spot. Would you mind relocating to another seat in first class?" There it was, the subtle, familiar suggestion. Not an order, not quite a request. But the implication hung in the air like stale coffee: "You don't belong here." Michael kept his tone steady. "I specifically chose this seat for the legroom. I need to work during the flight, so I'd prefer to stay where I am." Charlotte huffed dramatically. "This is ridiculous. I've sat in 2A on every Monday flight for the past 3 years. I have meetings right after we land." Passengers nearby began to shift uncomfortably. A few glanced up from their newspapers or smartphones. One man muttered, "Just let the man sit. He was here first." Amanda hesitated, clearly caught between protocol and favoritism. But she wasn't done, not yet. She nodded and walked briskly toward the galley, her eyes darting to Charlotte as she passed. What neither of them realized was that the next few minutes would trigger a chain of events that would shake their careers, and the entire airline, to its core. What should have been a routine cross-country flight was quickly turning into something else entirely. The tension in the first-class cabin of Aerolux Flight 381 was rising like a summer thunderstorm over the Great Plains, quiet at first, but unmistakable. Michael Carter remained calm in seat 2A, his expression composed, but his eyes revealed the fatigue of someone who had encountered this sort of subtle exclusion far too often. He returned his attention to his tablet, determined not to make a scene. But the matter wasn't over. Just as the last passengers were boarding, Ethan Brooks, the cabin supervisor in a neatly pressed navy blue uniform, made his way down the aisle with the purposeful stride of someone used to being obeyed. Trailing close behind him was Amanda, her hands nervously folded. "Sir," Ethan said in a tone that was more command than conversation, "I'm going to need you to switch seats so Ms. Bennett can be accommodated." Michael looked up slowly. "I've already explained to Amanda that this is my assigned seat. I booked it," paid full fare, and I'm a Platinum Elite member. I'm not moving." Ethan's jaw tightened. This seat is typically assigned to a long-time flyer who prefers it. "Preferences don't override seat assignments," Michael replied evenly. "Especially not when I followed every policy your airline put in place." From across the aisle, a passenger subtly turned their phone to record the exchange. Another leaned forward to listen more closely. The cabin had grown uncomfortably quiet, the hum of the engine drowned by the weight of the confrontation. Then, without warning, Charlotte Bennett stepped forward, pretending to adjust her carry-on bag in the overhead bin. With practiced discretion, she slipped a folded $100 bill into Amanda's pocket and whispered, "Thanks for helping handle this." The gesture wasn't as private as she had hoped. Several passengers saw it. One woman quietly began recording on her smartphone, her hands steady, her face tight with disapproval. Michael, still unaware of the bribe, simply raised an eyebrow. He had been through boardroom negotiations worth hundreds of millions, but this, being treated like an intruder in a space he had every right to occupy, cut deeper than any business slight ever had. Ethan leaned in closer. His voice dropped, but his words were still audible. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way, sir. Your choice." "I'm not moving," Michael said, his voice firm but calm. "This is my seat." Ethan turned on his heel and marched toward the cockpit. Within minutes, the cabin door opened, and Captain William Hart emerged. Tall, silver-haired, with the air of a man who'd flown over 10,000 hours, he tried to assert calm authority. But his presence only made the situation more serious. "My crew has discretion in these matters," the captain began. "And we're asking for your cooperation." "With all due respect, Captain," Michael responded, still seated, "I'm not violating any rules. I paid for this seat. I'm not giving it up because someone prefers it." Before the captain could respond, 2 airport security officers boarded the plane. The moment had arrived, one that would be captured by half a dozen cell phones and shared across the country within hours. As the officers approached, Michael reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and quietly hit record. "If I'm being removed," he said into the camera, "let it be known, I'm not being disruptive. I'm being displaced." And with that, the flight, and the airline, would never be the same again. As Michael Carter was escorted off the plane by 2 uniformed security officers, the cabin of Aerolux Flight 381 fell into an uneasy silence. Passengers stared, some ashamed, others confused, a few openly recording what they instinctively knew was wrong. One elderly gentleman in the second row muttered under his breath, "He didn't do anything wrong." But Michael didn't flinch. He gathered his belongings with quiet dignity, straightened his navy blazer, and walked the narrow aisle like a man who had been here before, not on an airplane, but in the face of injustice. Outside the aircraft, in the terminal lounge, Michael sat down, pulled out his phone, and made a calm but purposeful call. "Sarah, it's Michael. Assemble the legal team. We have a situation." Michael Carter wasn't just a well-dressed businessman or a platinum flyer. He was the founder and CEO of Right Tech Solutions, a $2.8 billion company headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. His company had developed cutting-edge AI software designed to root out bias in customer service, hiring, and corporate culture. His work had been featured in Forbes, Fast Company, and on 60 Minutes. And ironically, just hours before, he'd been scheduled to give a keynote speech on ethics and fairness in technology. Back in his early days, Michael had grown up in a modest 2-bedroom home in South Chicago, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs and still managed to help him with his math homework every night. At age 11, he taught himself to code on a refurbished desktop computer from Goodwill. While other kids played video games, he was building them. By 16, he had developed an early version of an algorithm that could detect biased language in customer service chatbots. It would become the foundation of his future empire. But behind every success was pain. When Michael was just 17, his father, an Army veteran and local mechanic, was killed in a robbery gone wrong. Michael stood by his father's gravesite and made a promise to build something that would make the world see every person for who they were, not what they looked like. That promise had fueled 2 decades of hard work. Michael had spent sleepless nights coding in a cramped studio apartment, eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner, working side gigs to keep the lights on. Now, his company employed over 5,000 people and had contracts with some of the biggest names in retail, healthcare, and even government agencies. What Aerolux didn't know, yet, was that Michael wasn't just another first-class passenger. His company had recently been in confidential negotiations to partner with Aerolux, helping to modernize their aging reservation systems and train their customer service staff using Right-Techa's bias detection tools. The proposed deal? A $50 million technology contract. Even more astonishing, Michael had personally acquired a 25% stake in Aerolux Airlines, slowly building equity through strategic partnerships and investor alliances. In corporate terms, that gave him significant influence, bordering on control. Now, the very airline that had publicly humiliated him was about to discover that the man they'd treated as disposable held their future in his hands. As Michael's phone buzzed with updates from his COO and legal counsel, he remained quiet, focused, and resolute. This wasn't just about one seat on one plane. It was about something much bigger. The reckoning had only just begun. By the time Michael Carter had reached the private lounge just past Gate 27, the first video of the incident had already hit the internet. It began as a 45-second clip, shot by a quiet young woman seated across the aisle in first class. The footage was clear and damning, a composed black man calmly defending his right to sit in the seat he had purchased, while airline staff grew increasingly hostile. The camera caught the bribe, Charlotte Bennett slipping folded cash into the flight attendant's pocket. And then, the final blow, Michael being escorted off the plane, flanked by security, his head held high. Within 1 hour, the video had racked up over 1.2 million views on platforms like X, formerly Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook. By noon, it had become a top trending story nationwide, accompanied by hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack, #AeroluxDiscrimination, and #Seat2AJustice. In living rooms across the country, Americans were beginning to pay attention. On daytime news shows like Good Morning America and The View, clips were replayed with commentary that ranged from outrage to disbelief. This wasn't just poor customer service, one host remarked. This was institutional disrespect. Retirees watching from home, veterans of their own struggles through decades of change in civil rights and equality, recognized the deeper current beneath the surface. This wasn't about seating, it was about dignity. About who is seen as worthy in public spaces, and who is expected to yield. Meanwhile, in Aerolux's glass-walled corporate headquarters in Dallas, the atmosphere was anything but calm. On the 12th floor, CEO Richard Halston had just been handed a printout of the video transcript by his public relations team. "We've got a problem," they said grimly. "Handle it like we always do," Halston replied at first, waving it off. "Issue a generic apology and offer a flight voucher." But then his phone buzzed. It was a call from Janet Rhodes, his director of communications. "Sir, we've identified the passenger," she said, her voice strained. "It's Michael Carter." There was silence on the line. "The Michael Carter?" Halston finally asked, barely above a whisper. "Yes. CEO of Right-Tech. He was set to be our keynote speaker next month, and we're in contract talks for the $50 million AI partnership. Another silence. Longer this time. What Halston didn't know, but would find out within minutes, was that Michael wasn't just a potential vendor. He was Aerolux's largest single shareholder, quietly acquiring 25% of their stock through intermediaries and strategic investments. Now, social media was ablaze. Influential voices from across the political and cultural spectrum were weighing in. Civil rights leaders, tech CEOs, celebrities, and even a few retired pilots voiced their disapproval. "This isn't just bad optics, it's systemic failure," wrote one editorial in the Washington Post. Aerolux's stock took an immediate hit. Down 12% by 2 p.m., analysts predicted steeper drops if leadership didn't respond swiftly and decisively. In the quiet of the lounge, Michael watched the headlines scroll across his phone screen. He wasn't smiling. This wasn't about revenge, it was about principle. For every passenger who didn't have the resources to fight back, this was a stand he had to take. And the world was watching. By late afternoon, the executive floor of Aerolux headquarters was a war zone. Phones rang off the hook. The legal department huddled in emergency conference calls. Screens across the building flashed stock tickers that only seemed to fall, down 18% and still dropping. Tense voices echoed through glass-walled offices as board members and executives scrambled for answers. Then came the email that brought everything to a halt. The sender, Michael Carter. The subject line, emergency shareholder meeting, immediate action required. The CEO, Richard Halston, stared at the message. He read it once. Then again. There was no mistaking the tone, it was direct, controlled, and uncompromising. Halston looked up at his assistant. "Get the board together. Now. Every single member." By 5 p.m., the Aerolux boardroom was filled. Executives in suits sat alongside shareholders still dressed in golf attire and business casual travel wear. Everyone looked uneasy. The incident had gone viral, but the ripple effects were only just beginning to surface. Then the doors opened. Michael entered, followed by his chief operating officer, Elise Morgan, and 2 members of his legal team. He wore the same navy suit he had been humiliated in just hours earlier. It wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a statement. Michael took a seat at the far end of the polished oak table. For a moment, the room was still. Then he spoke, his voice calm and deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what happened today was not only a violation of airline policy, it was a violation of basic human decency. I was asked to give up a seat I rightfully paid for, not because I posed a threat, not because I was disruptive, but because someone didn't like the way I looked in it." No one interrupted. "I am here in 2 capacities," he continued. "First, as a business partner you were courting for a $50 million modernization deal. That deal is now canceled, effective immediately." Halston flinched. The room tensed further. "Second," Michael said, "as Aerolux's largest individual shareholder, holding 25% of this company's stock. With the support of several aligned investors, I have influence over how this company moves forward, or doesn't." Then came the demand. "I am calling for the immediate termination of the 3 employees directly involved, Amanda Lewis, Ethan Brooks, and Captain William Hart. Not suspension. Not reassignment. Termination." A few board members exchanged nervous glances. "I don't make this demand lightly," Michael said. "But what happened today is emblematic of a culture that tolerates bias, enables favoritism, and turns a blind eye to what's right. That culture ends today, or so does my investment." Silence. Then, as if on cue, the boardroom door burst open. A young analyst, breathless and flushed, held out a tablet. "Sir," he said to Halston, "breaking update, our stock is down 26% and financial media is reporting that other major investors are considering pulling out." Halston looked from the analyst to Michael, then to the board. The weight of the decision pressed down like a thunderhead. Michael leaned forward, finishing what he came to say. "This isn't revenge. It's accountability." And with that, the future of the airline hung in the balance. The day after the emergency shareholder meeting, the mood at Aerolux Airlines had shifted from panic to something even more sobering, reckoning. The airline had no choice but to act, swiftly and publicly. The first step came before sunrise. A company-wide email was sent to over 18,000 employees across the United States. The subject line was simple, but powerful: "We must do better." Inside, a letter from CEO Richard Halston acknowledged the company's failure. "What happened aboard Flight 381 was unacceptable," the letter read. "We didn't just mishandle a situation. We betrayed our promise to treat every passenger with dignity and respect." Before the coffee had even finished brewing in most break rooms, the second announcement landed like a thunderclap: all Aerolux flights would be grounded for 48 hours, starting at midnight. It was unprecedented. In the history of U.S. commercial aviation, airlines had paused operations due to weather, mechanical failures, and even national tragedies, but never to address corporate bias. The move would cost Aerolux an estimated $38 million in revenue. But for Halston, and for Michael Carter, it wasn't about money anymore. That same morning, at a press conference broadcast live from Aerolux's Dallas headquarters, Michael stood beside Halston as they addressed the public. "This is not a PR stunt," Michael said clearly. "This is a cultural reset." The two men announced a sweeping partnership between Aerolux and Right Tech Solutions to launch a company-wide ethics and inclusion program. Every single employee, from gate agents to pilots to senior executives, would undergo intensive bias and empathy training, developed by behavioral psychologists and AI experts. This wasn't the standard click-through corporate video. It involved real-world simulations, role-play exercises, and mandatory discussions about race, identity, and accountability in the workplace. Workspaces across the country were quickly converted into training centers. Foldable chairs and projectors replaced airport lounge furniture. Even seasoned employees with 20- and 30-year tenures found themselves sitting in sessions, hearing uncomfortable truths, and confronting their own blind spots. For older workers, especially those nearing retirement, some of the material was difficult to process. A few resented the implication that they had anything to unlearn. But as the sessions continued, many began to reflect on past experiences in a new light. Stories were shared, walls were broken down, and for the first time in decades, people began to really listen to each other. Michael didn't just oversee the training, he participated in it. In one emotional session, a baggage handler in his 60s stood up and said, "I've worked here since Reagan was president, and I've seen a lot. But I've never seen someone like you come back to help, after being treated like that. Thank you." Outside the training rooms, changes were visible too. Aerolux announced new zero-tolerance policies around discrimination, harassment, and bribery. Employees were encouraged and protected if they reported misconduct. Performance reviews would now include a score for ethical behavior and inclusivity. By the end of the second day, the tone inside Aerolux had changed. Not completely, not perfectly, but it had started. For the first time, many employees saw their work not just as a job, but as a reflection of their values. And Michael? He wasn't just reclaiming his seat anymore. he was helping redefine what first class truly meant. While Aerolux Airlines began its transformation, the individuals responsible for the Flight 381 incident were facing a very different reality, one that would follow them far beyond the tarmac. In a quiet, windowless conference room on the fourth floor of Aerolux headquarters, Amanda Lewis, Ethan Brooks, and Captain William Hart sat in silence. The HR director entered with the company's legal counsel and 2 uniformed security officers. There were no pleasantries. No coffee. Just 3 identical folders placed neatly on the table. "This meeting is to inform you," the HR director began, "that your employment with Aerolux Airlines is terminated, effective immediately." Amanda gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. Ethan's face flushed deep red. Captain Hart, a 30-year veteran who had once flown international routes over the Atlantic, simply bowed his head, his silver hair glinting under the fluorescent lights. "We were following procedure," Ethan protested, his voice rising. "That man, he was being uncooperative. We had to maintain order." The HR director calmly turned her laptop around, revealing the viral video in full screen. The audio was crystal clear: Charlotte's bribe, Amanda's acceptance, Ethan's threat, and the captain's passive compliance. "Was this procedure?" she asked quietly. Amanda began to cry. "I knew it was wrong," she whispered. I didn't want to lose my job if I said no to Ethan or the passenger." Captain Hart remained silent. For the first time in his career, his authority had failed him, not in the cockpit, but in the moments that required moral courage. Within the hour, the 3 were escorted to collect their personal items. Other employees watched silently as they walked past, a reversal of the moment Michael had been walked off that plane. The symmetry was hard to ignore. But the consequences didn't stop there. A week later, Amanda sat in her 1-bedroom apartment, scrolling through job listings. Every airline she applied to had already seen the footage. Rejection emails flooded her inbox. One hiring manager had even recognized her on a Zoom interview. "Aren't you the flight attendant from that discrimination video?" The call ended less than 2 minutes later. Ethan Brooks, once proud of his supervisory title, was now avoiding public places. Friends stopped calling. Former colleagues distanced themselves. His LinkedIn profile was flooded with angry comments and reminders of his role in the scandal. Captain Hart, a decorated pilot with 3 decades of service, found the aviation industry suddenly closed to him. Not a single regional airline would consider hiring him, even for training roles. His career had come to an unceremonious end. And Charlotte Bennett? The woman who had sparked the confrontation with a wad of folded cash found herself at the center of national scrutiny. Aerolux permanently banned her from flying with the airline. Her employer, a high-profile marketing firm in Boston, placed her on indefinite leave. Friends quietly unfollowed her on social media. She had become the face of entitlement, dubbed first-class Karen across every platform from Reddit to late-night TV. For all 4, the fall from grace was swift and unrelenting. But to Michael Carter, justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about awakening. A message had been sent: in today's America, dignity cannot be bought, and accountability is no longer optional. 6 months after the events aboard Flight 381, Aerolux Airlines was no longer the same company. It wasn't just the branding or the headlines, it was something deeper. The culture had changed. The spirit of the place had shifted. In break rooms and gate lounges from Boston to Los Angeles, conversations once filled with complaints and indifference were now centered on service, respect, and inclusion. Staff at every level, baggage handlers, gate agents, flight attendants, pilots, had completed the Right Tech training initiative in full. And this wasn't just another check-the-box seminar. It was immersive, at times emotional, and deeply personal. Passengers were noticing too. Surveys showed a 12% increase in customer satisfaction, especially among Black, Hispanic, and Middle Eastern travelers, groups that had historically reported the lowest levels of satisfaction in the industry. The airline had rebuilt itself, not just to survive the storm, but to rise above it. And Michael Carter? He hadn't just moved on. He had leaned in. From his corner office at Right Tech's Atlanta headquarters, Michael launched a new initiative, the Second Chance Program, designed specifically for individuals who had lost their jobs due to bias-related incidents. The program offered a path to redemption, rigorous ethics training, emotional intelligence workshops, and vocational re-entry guidance. Accountability doesn't mean permanent exile, Michael explained during the program's press launch. It means you do the hard work to understand the harm, to change, and to rebuild trust. Among the first to enroll were Amanda Lewis, Ethan Brooks, and Captain William Hart. It wasn't easy for any of them. The coursework was demanding, emotionally and intellectually. Amanda spoke openly in group sessions about how fear and pressure led her to compromise her values. "I was more afraid of upsetting a frequent flyer than of doing the right thing," she admitted. "I'll never let that happen again." Ethan, once defensive, began to reflect on how his upbringing shaped his perspective. "I never thought I was biased," he shared. But bias isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's quiet and insidious, like believing some people don't belong in certain spaces. Captain Hart, nearing retirement age, had perhaps the most humbling journey. With decades in the cockpit, he'd never faced a crisis he couldn't navigate until this. But now, he found purpose not in flying, but in teaching. He joined the Second Chance program full-time as a mentor, helping others avoid the same mistakes. The airline's leadership began offering re-entry roles for graduates of the program, not as a publicity stunt, but as a model of restorative justice. Amanda returned to the industry as a ground crew coordinator for a regional airline in Denver. Ethan took a job in airline logistics, this time under new guidance and closer oversight. And Michael? He chose to reinvest in Aerolux gradually, not because they begged, but because they had earned it. Through transparency, reform, and humility, the airline had honored its commitment to become better. One rainy Tuesday morning, Michael visited an Aerolux gate at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. An elderly veteran in a wheelchair was being helped to his seat by a young flight attendant. She smiled, offered his favorite snack, and called him by name. Michael paused and smiled. This wasn't just a flight. It was the future he had always believed was possible, where everyone, regardless of background or status, was treated with the dignity they deserved. And for the first time in a long time, Michael boarded quietly, took his seat in 2A, and knew he truly belonged. This story reminds us that dignity is not a luxury, it's a birthright. No one, regardless of their race, background, or appearance, should ever be made to feel less than simply for existing in a space they've earned. For many older Americans who have witnessed decades of social change, this tale strikes a familiar chord. Progress is possible, but only when individuals stand firm in the face of injustice. Michael Carter's strength was not in retaliation, but in restraint. His calm courage teaches us that real power lies in principle, not position. And perhaps most profoundly, his decision to offer others a second chance reminds us that people are capable of growth when given the opportunity to reflect and rebuild. As we age, we carry both the wisdom of experience and the responsibility to guide future generations. This story challenges us to not only stand for what's right, but to do so with grace, patience, and purpose. Whether you're leading a company, a family, or simply living with integrity, the message is clear: kindness matters, Courage matters, and redemption is always worth offering.